I've been having fun with the titles of the sermons now, knowing that sometimes I throw them out there. So, title of the sermon today is It's Not You, It's Me. Up to this point, we're listening to Rabbi Jesus give his first teaching. And so far, he's given us the Beatitudes. It's the ladder out of death, out from under the shadow of death and darkness to become more like God. Because the Beatitudes are what God is like. And he's spoken to those who embrace the Beatitudes and said, you are salt. Not salty, salt. And salt grabs onto all the good around it, and it amplifies it. The flavor of salt is an amplification of anything good that it touches. Salt enhances. And so when we walk through the Beatitudes, are meant to be enhancements to all the lives we touch. Taking what is good and bringing attention to it. So important is this as the vocation of the Christian. This is our vocation. So important is it that Jesus says, if you are not a life-enhancing person for the lives you touch, you may as well not be a Christian because you're of no use. He draws the line here. If you're not finding the good in all that's around you to amplify it and call it out, Jesus says, I don't know what I can do with you. Sadly, as much of the church has made it their mission to evangelize through amplifying the bad, as the church amplifies the negative, it seems, according to the words of Jesus, the church has hamstrung its usefulness. Sadly. Following on our vocation as enhancers to life, our place is then as a light on top of a mountain. We have our vocation, we have our place. We're meant to shine forth for all to see and be drawn to, because love draws. It doesn't force, it doesn't break arms, it draws. We draw people up as they're attracted to be like us, and they ascend the mountain to join us. Sadly, once again, it seems the church at large has decided to leave its place as a drawing light on top of a mountain, and instead it has often charged down the slope at sword point into darkness to break arms and crack some heads. The challenge before the church at large from last week is to re-embrace the Beatitudes and to renew ourselves in our vocation and to reorient ourselves to our place on the mountaintop. And finally, last Sunday, we saw that Jesus anticipates the concern of his audience that he might be tossing out all that came before him. This sounds radical, and it was. And they said, what? If this is radical, it seems pretty new. What happens to everything else? And he says, first, I hold the scriptures that came before me in high value. They are the signposts that point to me, and I have come to fulfill them. Fulfill doesn't mean do them, as in they are a checklist of perfection. Fulfill means to be the one they were all pointing to and indicating. But it's almost an intangible. But what we find is that as their fulfiller, Jesus is the authority over the scriptures that served him. They served to point to him, and he's the authority over them. And so Jesus takes 6 case studies from Scripture, and he exercises his authority over them while teaching what everything is really all about. Don't murder. This is a good one. But also don't hold anger in your heart. Don't commit adultery. This is a good one. But also don't let discontent and lust build up in your heart. The first 2 are case studies that he builds upon with an addition of the heart. The next ones, though, are countered with the heart. It says that you can get divorced if you do it lawfully, but Jesus counters that divorce, except in the case of infidelity, shouldn't be allowed. It says that you take oaths to the Lord, but Jesus says, I counter that you should stick by every yes you say and every no you say. That's it. It says that you must take an eye for an eye with no mercy. But Jesus says, I counter with, you are not to retaliate. In each of these later cases, Jesus is not extending the law to our heart. He is, as the fulfilling authority and perfecter of the law, brushing it off, cleaning it up, and showing a heart that can counter it at times. And we see this in the final one as Jesus says that the law tells you to love your neighbor but hate your enemy. And Jesus says, I'm adjusting this, I'm tweaking this to say you are to love both neighbor and enemy. Jesus, as the authority of the law, perfects our knowledge of it. He clarifies, he counters, and he corrects. And so this morning, first, we jump to a moment at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. This is in Matthew 7, verses 28 and 29. As Jesus is speaking to the crowd, he wraps up, and the crowd is amazed because Jesus speaks with the authority that even their own law experts do not have. The Jewish experts of the law are subservient to the law. They could not, they dared not move pieces around like Jesus is now doing. But Jesus has placed himself as the fulfiller of the law and therefore the one who has authority to handle it. And to back up the bold and authoritative manner in which he is treating the law right now, his radicalness with this, to back up his authority that leaves the crowd shocked. After the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is going to go out and he's going to practically, into people's lives, assert his authority over demons and sickness and everything else as tangible evidence to prove his authority on this intangible part here. For now, before we get beyond the Sermon on the Mount, we're going to continue to look at the sermon. Jesus gave us a comment in chapter 5 that's important for us to catch in order to get where he's going with the sermon. And he told those listening to him, he said, you need to be more righteous than the Pharisees if this is going to work and you're going to come into the kingdom of heaven. We look back now and we can scoff because we now have disdain for the Pharisees, knowing they were a bunch of hypocrites. But to Jesus' audience, the Pharisees looked like the most righteous. They had dedicated their lives to the religion and the law of the Jewish people. They did the right things. They were experts in what was right. There was a righteousness of the Pharisees that looked good to those on the outside. And so, for Jesus to say, you need to be more righteous than them, is for someone to say, but they look really good. But Jesus will call the Pharisees, he will end up calling them whitewashed tombs. They look great on the outside, but inside is a place of death. Contrasted to them, the righteousness that Jesus calls for is going to involve finding life on the inside. It involves the heart, as we read through chapter 5. And we're going to keep reading what it looks like as we go into chapter 6. Chapter 6 divides into two parts, and the first part speaks of 3 personal practices of what we would call piety. They're the things we religiously do, and they're beneficial. And the 3 personal practices of piety are giving, prayer, and fasting. And we find these in Matthew chapter 6, verses 1 through 18. And I'll read this really quick. Beware of practicing your righteousness before others in order to be seen by them. for then you have no reward from your Father in heaven. So whenever you give alms, this is give charity, do not sound a trumpet before you as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, so that they may be praised by others. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward. But when you give charitably, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your charity may be done in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. And whenever you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at the street corners, so that they may be seen by others. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward. But whenever you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who is in secret. And your Father who is in secret will reward you. When you are praying, do not heap up empty phrases as the Gentiles do, for they think they'll be heard because of their many words. Do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask him. We're going to skip the Lord's Prayer. The Lord's Prayer is in here. We're going to skip it. We had a series on prayer, and it's not in focus right now, so we're going to skip that really quick. We're going to jump to verse 14. For if you forgive others their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses. And whenever you fast, do not look somber like the hypocrites, for they mark their faces to show others that they are fasting. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward. But when you fast, put oil on your head and wash your face, so that your fasting may be seen not by others, but by your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. There's so much cool stuff to unpack here. But this isn't a sermon series on the Sermon on the Mount. So some of it's going to be left for another time, but we're going to at least have to catch some rabbit trails on this. And we're going to begin by considering that plays with actors on a stage, putting on a performance, these were very popular in the ancient world. It was their TV sitcoms and their movies. It's what they had. And the word hypocrite refers to the actors of a play. The word generally refers to people who are playing at being someone they are not. The idea of an actor is that they can make you forget who they really are, and they can convince you that they're someone else and pull you into another story that they're putting on. What we find with the hypocrites in Scripture, though, is that they have not only deceived others who think the hypocrites are amazingly holy people, but we'll find they have often also deceived themselves. They don't believe that they're merely acting holy. They believe they are holy. They have lost themselves into their acting to believe that the role they are playing is the truth of who they are. And they cannot see themselves then for what they really are. As to these three practices, Jesus speaks with the assumption that these three things will be done by God's people. God's people will give charitably. God's people will pray. They will speak to God. And God's people will fast. Fasting is one to stop on here really quick, because fasting is one that can confuse, and it's one that is actually not spoken of much in Scripture. There isn't a clear system of fasting that the Bible lays out as a requirement. And to even seek a clear system of fasting is to fall back again into the desire of a checklist that Jesus is preaching against anyway. In general, what we find is that fasting and how it's done is typically simply informed by the culture that one is in. And it's left up to each of us to decide if and when we might fast. The culture, our own desires can inform when we choose that we want to fast, if we want to. Something sad that fasting has turned into is something that ran through the first church that I attended as an adult. It's the idea that I particularly fast when I need something from God. What fasting turns into in this case is an attempt at a manipulative hunger strike. I go on a hunger strike in order to attempt to make God do something or to receive something spiritually. David gives us insight into the proper fasting in Psalm 69:10. We don't have this on a slide, but if you want to read this later, you can, but I'll just tell you what it says. He says that he humbles his own soul with fasting. In other words, he uses fasting as a check on himself, not as a manipulative tactic against God. And he goes on to say in Psalm 69, verse 13, as for what I'm praying to you, God, about, when you, God, find it to be an acceptable time, would you please answer my prayer? He's not attempting to manipulate God through his fasting. His fasting is for his own improvement, his own humbling and check. And he leaves God's timeline, God's answer to prayer up to God. For David, fasting was about himself, and God's things are left up to God. No hunger strikes for David. The way the hypocrites do these things, all three of these tactics, or all three of these practices for us, tactics for them to put on a good show. The way the hypocrites do these things is to put on an act for others and even put on an act for themselves, to convince others and often convince themselves that they are more than what they really are on the inside. We're going to follow the idea of the hypocrite into Matthew chapter 7, verses 1 through 2. It begins, do not judge so that you may not be judged. For the judgment you give will be the judgment you get, and the measure you give will be the measure you get. We talked about this a few weeks ago with the Beatitude of mercy. The Bible presents my judgment as a kind of choose my own adventure book. I get to choose how things will go for me, relative to how I attempt to make things go for others. When I used to work as a personal trainer, you're looking to discipline people, and it's not always pleasant what you're going to lead people through. And one of my questions was, how aggressive do you want me to be to you? I'm going to grow and develop someone much more leniently who is a single mom working overtime to make ends meet, but she is also on occasion attempting to work on her own health. There's going to be lenience there. And she can say, take this into account, that this is what I am, but I want to get started somewhere. Much more lenience there compared to the person who comes to me and says, I want to compete in the bodybuilding show in 6 months from now. So the question in personal training was, how aggressive do you want me to be to you? I picture it much the same way with the Bible and how God is presenting a choice to me. God offers me the same question. How aggressively do you want me to work? And I point to you, and perhaps to you, and I say, pull out your sledgehammer, God. Get them. Smash the crap out of them. So I watch God pull out his sledgehammer. And he comes towards me and he says, okay, are you ready? And And I say, no, 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 not me, not me. Them. Hammer for them the gentle feather of correction for me, please. But Jesus says that's not how this works. And he goes on in verse 3. So why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but not notice the log in your own eye? Or how can you say to your neighbor, let me take the speck out of your eye, while the log is in your own eye? You hypocrite! First, deal with yourself. Take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your neighbor's eye. The word for speck here is really a sliver of wood, a splinter or a twig. And I'm getting really bent over this minute piece of wood they have in their eye, while I am oblivious to the fence post I have in mine. And first in this, we can notice that the hypocrites are not only concerned with how good they are judged on their external appearance by others, but then they judge and respond to how bad others look on the outside. Secondly, what we can notice, though, is that how are the issues presented here? The issues are presented as blind spots in our own vision. Spots where vision or perception has been injured or hindered. And I'm condemning this person or that person for having this minute sliver in their eye that is preventing them from seeing something that I can so obviously see on their behalf for them. And I want to condemn them for the things they're doing wrong in these areas of their life where they can't even really see it yet. While I, in comparison, have my own huge blind spots. What happens to a religious hypocrite? What happens to a religious actor is self-deception. And as a hypocrite, they do not notice the alarmingly large plank in their own eye. There is one form of blindness. That is me. In the first degree of blindness, me having areas in my life that I have not yet had a chance to fully bring the light of God into. I am in process for my entire life, and God will work with me through my entire life. First degree blindness are those areas where I'm just blind because we haven't got there yet. But then there is another degree of blindness. There is second degree blindness, where I have, through hypocrisy, made myself blind to my own blindness, convincing myself that I can see everything. And Jesus says that I need you to get past your own deception of who you are. Jesus says I need to realize and then tend to my planks. This involves getting to know myself deeper than my false self, the hypocrite, that not only puts on a show for others, but puts on a show for myself. And what Jesus says is that when we get to know ourselves and we realize we have glaring issues, second degree blindness. And then when we deal with our planks, our first degree blindness, we will then deal with the slivers in others. Why? Because when I've done the work to realize who I am, with all of my issues, I will then come to the sliver in someone else's life in an entirely different way. When initially my original concern was just for them to straighten up how they look on the outside. Having dealt with my own planks, I will come to them now with empathy, mercy, charity, and love. To mingle my thoughts with a story from a guy named Brad Jerzak. He tells of early in his time of ministry as a church leader when he felt the need to be corrective to others. And he was so. A mentor gave him the discipline that for as long as Brad felt the need to correct someone, he should first pray and fast for them until the sense of needing to correct them left him. So Brad began this practice. And he would reach a place where he no longer felt the need to correct them. He didn't want to correct them. And sometimes then it was in that time that God would say, now I do want you to speak to them. And Brad would think, but now I don't want to. My heart has been changed. Brad came to see how inadequate he was to even dare then to place himself over someone as a corrector. And it was in this time when Brad no longer needed to talk to them that God would then have him really go to this person and speak to them without his initial agenda and with mercy and gentleness. Often this process of prayer and fasting to remove the need to correct, the prayer and fasting process would often take enough time too, that time passed from the issue that had happened and it was disarmed and there was no longer a defensiveness or a reactivity to the event. And now, when you reach a reluctance to come to someone, what you will find is that when you do come to them, when God says, but I want you to, no longer out of a need to correct, but out of love, you will no longer come over them as a corrector, but you will come alongside them as a facilitator, an empowerer, and a loving companion. So great. I'm ready to fight the need to call out everyone else's problems, and I'm ready to consider where are the fence posts in my eyes. But if I'm under self-deception, if that's where I fall to, where do I start? How do I even know what planks are in my eyes if I can deceive myself so well? The easiest place for me to start is by examining in myself the issue related to the sliver I so badly want to correct in someone else. More often than not, the piece of the problem that I can often see in someone else is related to a problem I have in me. And I'm actually reacting adversely to what is in them that is what I have worked so hard to cover up in me. So to find your planks, I suggest you start considering where are you finding slivers in others. And look at those in your own life. Turn it back to yourself. All through Jesus' teaching in the Sermon on the Mount, it turns back, it turns back, and it turns back again to me and my heart. We are constantly in this sermon hearing what the announcement of Jesus foretold way back at the beginning of Matthew's gospel. That Jesus is here to save me from me, not us from them. He is the fire that will purify me from all that pollutes me. And it all centers around my own heart. More specifically, it centers around my heart as my heart becomes a heart of love. My heart's nature grows towards the nature of God, who is pure love.